So you may not know the name Anselm, but he was an extremely important theologian who lived towards the end of the 11th century. His ministry actually began in a monastery in Normandy, France, right around the time of the Norman invasion of England, right? 1066, William the Conqueror and all that. Well, he would eventually, Anselm would, become the first Norman, a Frenchman, the first Norman to be Archbishop of Canterbury. And yet, Anselm repeatedly displayed an independence of spirit and mind that would bring him into conflicts with the English kings. Of course, they were Normans, William II, the son of William the Conqueror, and Henry I. Twice, Anselm would be exiled to Rome. And he would die shortly after his return to England at the end of his second exile in 1109. But I mention Anselm tonight because he wrote a pair of really important treatises. They go together. One called Monologion and the other called Proslogion. And these two treatises, these two books, they worked together to offer proofs for the existence of God. And they really do serve as significant milestones in the history of theology. Our teaching elders who went through seminary undoubtedly had to read, or they would have if they'd taken me, undoubtedly would have had to read something from Anselm. Of the two, Proslogion was the most significant, most well known. And that's because Anselm begins the treatise with a preface that set forth his intention in words that continue to shape not just the history of theology, but all intellectual endeavor. There in the preface, he wrote, "I have written the following short tract dealing with the question of the existence of God, as well as several others, from the view of one trying to raise my mind to contemplate God and seeking to understand what I believe." And a few lines later, he wrote, "I do not seek to understand so that I might believe, but I believe so that I might understand." It was this determination to start with faith and then move to understanding, and not the other way around, to start with faith and to move to understanding, that caused Anselm to actually title that treatise, Faith Seeking Understanding. And when you think about it, faith seeking understanding is the exact posture we ought to have when we think about education as Christians. I mean, after all, we are believers in Jesus Christ. We confess that he is Lord over all. All authority in heaven and on earth belongs to Jesus, we would say. He rules over creation. He rules over this world through his providence. He rules over the church. He rules over us as individuals. He rules over the state. He rules over the church. And that means we can't approach learning, no matter what kind of learning it is and who's doing the teaching, outside of faith in and obedience to Jesus is Lord. Now, it's important to say right from the start that what I'm going to say tonight is not necessarily a brief for Christian education. And that's for the simple reason that sometimes Christian schools or colleges or even seminaries don't always fully recognize and understand how Christ as Lord actually should shape the process of teaching and learning. How faith should be central in seeking understanding. It very well may be that in a radically secular context, you might actually be able to engage in the process of teaching and learning from the perspective of Christ's Lordship easier than in other venues. So I'm not talking about the kind of school per se, but what I am talking about is that at the very heart of education, which I would boil down to the process of teaching and learning in a community of learners. At the very heart of that, for a Christian is the affirmation that Christ is Lord, and that shapes then everything about the way we go about teaching and learning. And so tonight we have to consider, I think intentionally, the true source of all of our learning, the original sphere of that learning. Where do we first engage in the education process? And then what is that process of teaching and learning? What does it look like, biblically described? And then finally, what's the ultimate goal of our learning, regardless of discipline and regardless of venue? And I think if we can answer those questions, the source, the sphere, the process, and the goal, we might begin to get our hands around what it looks like for Christ to be Lord over our educations. But first tonight, if we're going to consider how Christ is Lord over education, over this process of teaching and learning, then we have to think first about who the source of knowledge is. And if you're thinking in your head, well, God is, Jesus is, that is the right answer, right? Sometimes we make this more complicated than we ought to. Sort of like the story you've undoubtedly heard some preacher tell of the Sunday school class where the Sunday school teacher was teaching on Noah and the ark. And so they are doing the craft, and they made this boat, and they have the animals, and the teacher was getting up to her key point, which was to say, all right, children, who is the one who led the animals into the ark? And there was silence in that first grade class, and then finally Billy raised his hand, and he said, well, I think it's actually Noah, but I know the right answer is Jesus. Well, in this instance, the right answer really is Jesus. At the end of the day, the axiom that all truth is God's truth is actually right. He is the creator and maker of all things. And we are actually at work in his world trying to learn how he put this world together. And whatever truth comes out of those investigations is ultimately God's truth because he is the maker of all things. And we start with that confidence, with faith, and then we seek understanding. But there's actually a biblical story that teaches us this, that God is the source of all learning, no matter what kind of learning it is, what kind of literature or language, what kind of science or knowledge you might posit. God's the source of it. There's a biblical story, and it's actually Daniel chapter 1. You might remember Daniel 1. Daniel and his friends have been taken from Judah to Babylon. It's the first raid of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. And he has taken some of the royal family and the nobility, the cream of the future leaders of Israel, and he has taken them to Babylon. And among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And Nebuchadnezzar takes these 4 young men and he enrolls them at the University of Babylon. In fact, Daniel 1:4 says that he does this to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And Nebuchadnezzar not only provides education, but these boys had a full ride. They had tuition plus room and board. Of course, the problem was the room and board, right? It was the meat and wine that they were being offered because it had been offered previously to Marduk, to the chief Babylon god. And Daniel and his friends could not and would not eat it. And in refusing to do so, what were they saying? Well, they were demonstrating their faithfulness to God and the confidence that God would prove faithful to them in the midst of their exile. And what happens? Well, of course, as you know, God proves faithful. Not only did they pass the food test, they passed all their tests. Daniel 1:17 says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Wait a second. Did you hear what was just said? This is pagan literature and language. This was dream interpretation and magic. Could believers in Yahweh know these things? Could they study these things? Well, yes, but don't miss it. Who gave the knowledge? God did. In fact, the word gave in Daniel 1 is the key verb throughout the chapter. The God who gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 1, verse 2, is the same God who gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, chapter 1, verse 9, who is in fact the same God who gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Who sent Daniel into exile? Who gave them favor? Who gave them learning? God did. He's the source of learning. He is the one who is Lord over Daniel and his friends, and he's the Lord over us as we go about learning. When we approach teaching and learning from the position of confessing his lordship, what we are saying is that God is the source of all truth, and that as believers and followers in Jesus, we are free to learn at University of Babylon or wherever else God takes us educationally, because God is the source of learning. But the original sphere in which we learn is actually the family. And that's what Deuteronomy 6, I think, teaches us so well. Deuteronomy 6 is one of the key chapters in the entire Bible. It was central for the Old Testament people of God, particularly chapter 6, verse 4. That's called the Shema. It was the central prayer and affirmation of the Old Testament people of God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. It's the great statement of exclusivity against whatever else the pagans in the promised land might claim. There were no other gods, Israel declared, but Yahweh, the covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who brought them out of the land of Egypt, who had redeemed them from slavery and was bringing them to the promised land. He is the true God. Now think about that. What is that a confession of? It's a confession of the lordship of God. God is Lord. He is Lord over all things. He was Lord in Egypt. He's Lord in Israel. He's Lord in Europe. He's Lord in Asia. He's Lord in America. There is no other God. There is no other Lord than this one. But I ask you tonight, how is that affirmation to be passed down? How were God's people to learn it? What was the sphere in which that affirmation was to be transferred? Well, it's the family. You saw that in chapter 6, verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Our families are the spheres, the original spheres, in which this affirmation of the lordship of Christ over all things, that this God who's come near to us in Jesus is Lord over all things. The place where that's learned is originally in the family. So God's the source of learning. All that we learn ultimately has its roots in God because all truth is his truth. We learn that he is Lord over all things in the family. But what's the process of learning? Well, from the teaching side, the family uses every opportunity to teach. Right? That's what you just heard in verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. So that every place we go offers an opportunity to teach. So that when we're working on a car, now that's not actually something I've ever done in my life, but when we're working on a car, there's an opportunity to talk about not just the complexity of this machine, but the complexity of creation, of how God has put this marvelous world together. And just as there was a designer of this F-150, so God is the great designer of all that is. Or when we're doing yard work, planting the plants that your wife bought at the Memphis Botanical Garden sale this weekend. There's an opportunity to see something of the beauty of God's world and to talk about how the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And even when we don't purchase flowers, how is it that God feels full? Try to say that 3 times fast. Full of wildflowers. Or who observes the waterfalls when no one's there in Western North Carolina? At the end of a November day when there's no hikers. God does. He made them for his own pleasure. Or when we're driving our cars on a cross-country trip or up the interstate, and we might point out the different birds that we see, which is something our family has noticed a lot more in the past few years. And we remind ourselves that God provides for the birds of the air, and so it is that he provides for us as well. There's always an opportunity in that original sphere of the family to connect teaching and learning in such a way that we affirm the Lordship of Christ over all things. There's also a learning side to this, because there's the presumption that within our family, our children will feel free to and will in fact ask lots of questions. That's the second part of what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 6. When your son asks you in time to come, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? That's the opportunity. When the questions are asked about whatever it is, to connect what we're talking about back to the Lordship of Christ. So whether it's a great athlete or a recent movie or a book that everybody's reading, or whether it's some course that our kids are taking in school, some book they have to read for class, some algebraic formula that doesn't quite make sense to them but has importance and meaning. At each point along the way, when they ask questions, we have an opportunity to teach and to connect these things back to the Lordship of Christ. And this teaching and learning process that begins originally in the family is what more times than not we hand over to other educators who stand in the place of the parents. The Latin phrase is in loco parentis. And as they stand in the place of the parents, what are they doing? Teaching and learning, connecting the dots, hopefully, but if not, then we come alongside to help connect the dots between what our children are learning and what the Lordship of Christ is all about. Because regardless of the school, whether public or private, whether secular or Christian, whether university or a medical school, this process modeled within the family should be the process in which we reflexively engage so that we maintain our curiosity about this world that God has made. And as we explore it, seeking the truth that's right here in front of us, this truth that is God's truth, we continue to teach and we continue to learn in such a way that we affirm that Christ is Lord over all, because that is the goal. The goal, as the Apostle Paul noted in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, is to take every thought captive to obey Christ. That's true spiritually, of course. I mean, we long for all our thoughts and words and doings, all our days and all our hours to be all for Jesus. But it's true of our learning as well. And so we ask, how does Plato's Republic, how do we take that captive to obey Christ? Or how does critical race theory, whatever truth it may or may not contain, how does that help me to see this world differently so that I might obey Christ? Or how does research and learning about the development of synthetic ivory or the development of a new polymer adhesive, how does that work to serve Christ? Because after all, this world is his world. And whatever truth Plato or race theory or polymer research offers, it's God's truth. Now, friends, the affirmation that from him and through him and to him in Romans 11 and Colossians 1, that's not just true about spiritual stuff. It's true of all of life. Wherever we look, wherever we turn, all things are from him and through him and to him. And so if our faith is going to be more than Sunday only private affirmations, doesn't it need to seek understanding? Doesn't it force us out into God's world with boldness and confidence to explore this world, to learn, to teach? Don't we long to see how it is that Christ's lordship extends to every part of our lives? If that's true of you, then surely Christ is Lord over our educations, wherever we may receive them, because Christ is Lord over every square inch of this world. Thanks be to God. Please pray with me. Almighty God, we do confess boldly in the midst of a world that denies your lordship, even denies your existence, that you are Lord over all things. Lord, as we think about education, our own educations perhaps, as